Democrats are losing me. You're losing me. Jim Clyburn, one of the senior most serving Dems in DC, he's been in the House serving South Carolina since, I think, 93, 94. He's 84, was asked about the need for some fresh young blood in the party leadership, etc. And his response to this question of retiring, again, he's 84, serving his 17th term. What do you want, me to give up my life? Yes. Yes. You are a public servant. Your seat in Congress is not about your life. It's about your constituents and the millions of Americans affected by your votes on policy and the tone you set for the country as an influential person in power. That is one of the most indicting quotes I've heard from a Democrat since the election. An election lost, mind you, because our first choice, our first run at it up until 100 days out, was with a dementia-ridden cancer patient. And you're 84 years old and you just witnessed that campaign and what resulted. And not to mention all of the Democrats currently who are so old, they're dying in office. They're passing away midterm because they're that old. And you're concerned at 84 years old about your life? Unbelievable selfishness. I had no idea the geriatric rot in the party was this bad.
So we're in a really intense conversation right now across the Democratic Party about older leadership, and it's happening on a couple of fronts. It's happening around this Gosby book around Joe Biden. It's happening as now 3 Democratic members of Congress have passed away in office in the last 5 months. And it's happening at a moment in which Democratic leadership in Congress is keeping younger folks out of power, stopping people like AOC from becoming committee chairs, avoiding primaries. It's bad. And I think a thing being left out of this conversation across all these fronts is that the only people who can genuinely decide to leave is the elected leader themselves. Part of the reason there wasn't a ton of pressure on Joe Biden to step aside or to not run again for re-election was because he was the only person who could make that call. And there was no reason to assume that a guy who'd been running for president since, the 80s, the 90s, was going to put his ego aside. And we've seen from these Gosby books that they weren't pressing him internally. It's why we have to have this conversation in public, because we can tell they're not going to do it in private. But zooming out even further, it's worth asking, why don't these older leaders want to give up power? Besides the obvious reasons, because power is great and you get nice cars, you get to be called a congressman or president, whatever, because power is fun. But it's also their whole identity. And I write about this a ton in my new book, When We're in Charge, about how you can't make your job everything that you are. And being an elected official is many things, but also it is just a job. If your whole self-esteem, if your whole ego, if your whole sense of self is wrapped up in this idea that I am an elected official, I'm a politician, then when you no longer hold that office, who the fuck are you? And I think we've heard some of these older leaders say that, what are they going to do when they leave office? What are they supposed to do? Spend time with their family? It's so sad. And I talked to a lot of younger members of Congress for this book, and a bunch of them would say to me, I don't want this job to be all of who I am. And I think that's healthier for elected officials to have an identity outside of their call to service. Even for jobs that are callings, they cannot be all of who you are. Now, creating a life where your job is important, but not everything, is really difficult. It's a thing I write about a ton in the book, but I want more for these older leaders than what they're currently getting. And we all deserve more from our public servants.
Oh, you're just being ageist. That's bigotry. That's what Jerry Connolly, now deceased, and Nancy Pelosi have been saying for years as young people criticize them for hanging onto their seats for too long. Now, look, I'm going to say something controversial and Democrats might get mad at me. But Jerry Connolly, in all of the things that he has done, he's not a good person. He has failed us. He failed the United States, and he should be remembered as someone who cared more about himself than as someone who cared about democracy. And Nancy Pelosi, I personally really like her. She's been really good to my community. I'm a combat vet. I know what she's done for our community. She has met with veterans organizations on a regular basis, whether she's speaker or not, for something like 2 decades, for my entire adult life. But with that being said, Nancy Pelosi, from a hospital bed, whipped votes against younger members of Congress so that Jerry Connolly could be the ranking member of the Oversight Committee. And he just croaked. And because he and 2 other old and sick Democrats have passed away in the 5 months since we've had a new Congress, in the 6.5 months since we had an election, that is the only reason that the big, beautiful bill, Donald Trump's tax scam, passed the House. Now, here's why I'm saying that Jerry Connolly should be remembered as someone who cared more about himself, someone who is fundamentally more selfish than anything else, that his pride and his office mattered more to him than our democracy, because that dude has been in office forever, was sick, and after all of that time and experience in office, he never thought that out of the 760,000 plus people in his congressional district, that anyone was worthy of that seat but him. In the decades that he was in office, he never transmitted his knowledge, his experience, or his network for things like fundraising and getting bills passed. All those years in office, and he never thought he should pass those on. He'd rather go to the grave holding on to his seat than let a younger, healthier person take his place. Look, I think Democrats, we need to police ourselves in the right kind of way. It's important to stand up against bigotry, and that includes ageism. But I want you to listen carefully to what I am saying, because it is not ageist to say that a person in Congress ought to be concerned about what happens to America after they pass away. That is not an ageist statement. That is patriotism. So when we, Democrats, liberals, progressives, whatever we are, when we confront members of Congress in their 60s, 70s, 80s who've been in office for decades, we shouldn't just say, you're too old, you need to leave. We should ask, who have you mentored? Mr. Congressman, Mr. Jerry Connolly, who have you mentored out of the 760,000 on average people who are in your district? Who is the person who's going to carry on your legacy? Or would you rather Democrats and democracy lose important votes than to have somebody waiting in the wings for when you get too old and sick to continue? Because if we just say, you're too old, you need to leave office, they're going to get defensive. They're going to shut down. And out of all the criticisms that these people face, those kind of things really hurt because it reminds them of their own mortality. And someone like Nancy Pelosi will respond to an accusation that she's too old. She will talk about her fundraising prowess, her ability to whip votes and get things passed. She has a long storied history. She is a powerful and a more accomplished woman than there really are in the history of American politics. And I honor and respect that. But if you are a grandma or a grandpa or a great-grandma or a great-grandpa and you've been in Congress for several decades and you don't have a successor who you have mentored over the decades, who is ready to stand on your shoulders and your accomplishments and receive your endorsement, who's not your fucking kid, then everything that you've done in office to build your reputation, to build your legacy, has been about building your legacy. It has not been about us. It has not been about your constituents. It has not been about the Democratic Party, our democracy, or the Constitution. It's been an exercise in narcissism. Jerry Connolly, rest in peace, is a narcissist. Dianne Feinstein, narcissist. Joe Biden, narcissist. The notorious RBG, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, narcissist. It's up to us, the people, to explain to members of Congress, to presidential candidates, to judges, that their legacy isn't just defined by what they accomplish. It's about what they allow people in the future to accomplish in their absence. So let's not say that we need to get the gerontocracy out. Let's not say that we need to get the people in their 70s and 80s out of the party or out of office. Let's say that we need to get rid of the narcissists. If you get the chance to confront your member of Congress, they're the most accessible in office at the federal level. Ask them who they've mentored. Ask them who's going to be able to step up into their place when they get too old or frail or vulnerable to continue serving their constituency. If they don't have an answer, They're a narcissist, and that's why they need to be removed from office. That's why they need to be primaried. That's why they need to get out. It's not about age. It's about caring about themselves more than they care about the future of America. Because at the end of the day, your legacy is not in the history books. It's not on a library somewhere. It's not a statue that maybe goes into the rotunda if you're lucky. Your legacy is about what you empowered the next generation to do after you were gone.
Democratic Congressman Jerry Connolly's death last week is fueling the argument that older incumbents should step aside. If Democrats had his vote, it's possible they could have blocked or at least delayed House Republicans' sweeping spending bill passed last week. Sahil, a tough topic, but probably one that needs to be had.
Yeah, that's right, Mika. This intra-party debate about age and power is escalating, and the argument for generational change is gaining traction now in new corners of the Democratic Party. We know there's been an ongoing reckoning with President Biden and his ill-fated attempt to run for re-election. But now there's a new factor fueling the challenge to this culture of seniority, which is the fact that Democrats are weakened by older lawmakers in their ranks in poor health who keep dying in office. In the House last week, Republicans passed President Trump's massive bill by a one-vote margin. Democrats had 3 vacancies due to deaths within their ranks, all members with health issues in their 70s. If Democrats had those votes, Republicans would not have had the votes, even with full attendance, unless they flipped at least one of their members who voted present or no. And some Democrats, as you can imagine, are quite angry about this. David Hogg, the DNC vice chair, who has called for primaries against out-of-touch incumbents, told me his party has, quote, empowered the cruelty of Republicans and handed them an expanded majority because elderly Democratic leaders refused to step down. He calls it unconscionable, goes on to say that Democrats must create a set of incentives where politicians decide it's in their best interests to retire, and he says that includes primaries. Of course, gerontocracy isn't just a Democratic Party problem, but they have it on a larger scale. Take a look at this list. The last 8 members of Congress who have died in office, all of them are Democrats. 3 died in just the last 3 months, 6 of them in the last 16 months. Now, Democrats acknowledge Republicans may have passed their bill anyway, ultimately, but they don't see why they're making the GOP's task easier, especially at a time where congressional majorities are expected to be narrow for the foreseeable future and where every vote counts. That is where this argument is gaining traction among veteran Democratic strategists, such as Mike Nellis, who has advised many Democrats, including former VP Kamala Harris. He told me, quote, you get accused of ageism when you start having this conversation sometimes, but he said, look at an actuarial table. And he says it's a fair criticism to say that Democrats need people to walk away and know when it's your moment to go off into the sunset. He insists this sentiment is growing and won't go away in the party until that change is realized. And to be clear, Mika, they're not arguing that everyone past a certain age needs to go. It's about challenging politicians and forcing long-serving members to justify their continuity, to get challenges, and to not treat these jobs as essentially life-tenured. An important dynamic to keep an eye on in the run-up to the midterm elections and the next presidential election, one that could change the culture of the Democratic Party.